So now that we've planned out a rough version of the scene, in this video we're going to build out the environment for the final version of the scene. Now for most shots you could probably get by with just a 2D background image like we have currently. But we're going to do something more elaborate for the sake of demonstration. We're going to build this scene in 3D. So when you're working with 3D, down here you're going to want to set your stage to at least 2 views. We'll use the right one to view what the camera is actually seeing, and on the left we can use the orbit tool to rotate the workspace and get a 3D view of the scene, and see how our scene elements are positioned relative to the camera, which is this purple thing over here. Now when we're in an orbited view like this, we can use the regular layer transform tool to move our layers along the z-axis if we want. For example, with the globe selected, I can bring that forward so it's closer to the camera. Let's adjust our other view so we can actually see what's happening. Just hold Shift to restrict the thing you're moving to whichever direction you're moving. Or you can take elements like our background and push them farther away. Just remember to also scale things so they appear the right size in the camera frame. But this isn't the background we're actually going to use, so I'll hide that for now. I showed you before that I have a 3D model of the library scene. And to bring that in, I just need to go to File, Import, and I'll do General Import. Originally, I set up this library model in a program called SketchUp that lets you import free 3D models from the SketchUp warehouse. I downloaded a full model of a library and then just cut off the walls to see inside it and added the hallway section. Then I exported it as a .obj file, which is the 3D format that Moho can use. Then it's going to prompt us to create a 3D object layer, and we do want to check scale to Moho. And now it's in the scene, but it's a little small. You can use the layer transform tools on the 3D object layer, like any other, to scale it up. Then we want to position the environment so that our rough animation is positioned correctly. Now something important to understand is that when you have separate layers, even if they're positioned in 3D, Moho doesn't treat them as truly part of the same 3D space. It's always going to render one layer on top of another. So for example, here, even though it seems like Betsy should be in the hallway, she's getting blocked by the library model. To fix that, we need to drag the library model to the bottom of the layer stack. So now she'll always appear in front of it. If you want Moho to do this automatically, you can go in your project settings and check Sort by Layer Depth, and I'll also check Sort by True Distance. So now that we can see her in the hall, we need to move the hall so she starts in the right place and our rough animation will hopefully line up. I can see on the temp background that she should start out 3 windows down the hall. And most importantly, she needs to end up pressed against the wall just before the library entrance. So now that the model is positioned right, let's talk about how it's being rendered. We don't really need to mess with this until we're done animating, but just to introduce these settings, with the model layer selected, if we go to Window and choose Light, we get this control that lets us position the direction the light is coming from that lights this model, as well as the intensity and distance. Now you'll notice Moho does a sort of toon shading effect, which is why the light appears in these bands. To change that, we actually need to go into the material settings. On the layer settings for the model, on the material tab, we have settings for each material in the model. This is a particularly complex model, so there's quite a few. But let's look at the settings for the wallpaper here. I happen to know from making the hallway that this material is Formica Laminate Dark. Now if I change the drop downs on here to 8 bands instead of 3, there's a slightly smoother look to the toon shading. And you can also change how the material reflects different types of light. Now I'm not going to adjust all of these until later after we have our effects in and do the final color adjustments. Right now we have some more elements to get into the scene. We need to put some scenery outside the windows here. So I'm going to go to File, Import, And this time I'm going to import a Moho object. I have a skyline set up in a different Moho file. And when I do that, it gives me the option to pick the layers to use. I want all of them. And what's nice is when I import them, they come as separate layers. I'm going to put them in a group and then move them back and scale them up. Now I want to spread out the depth of some of these layers a little bit. And I can get rid of the outline on these ground levels. Then I'll adjust the size of each layer so they look good outside the window. Next, I want there to be a little courtyard outside, so I'm going to bring in a garden wall. This time I want to import a vector file, and it's an SVG. Then I'm going to try to position and scale it so it lines up with the actual front side of the library. Now, something you might find when you scale up a vector object is that your strokes get super thick. To fix that, we just need to go to Edit, Normalize Layer Scale. And now that looks right. And I can finish positioning that. Now, one last thing. I want a ground plane outside, so I'll make a vector layer called ground and draw a big rectangle on it. And then in the style palette, I'll set the effect to image texture and use this grass tile image. Then I'm going to use the rotate XY tool to turn the ground so it's flat. Actually, up here I can just type in 90 degrees for the X rotation. Then I just need to position the ground plane. And actually, it looks like maybe I want sort by true distance off. Now that shows up where I want it. And I'll scale the grass texture down to a better size. And then I'm going to put all the contents into a group to make it easy to move the scene around relative to the camera if I need to. Okay, so that's as much positioning as I can do without knowing the final camera angles. So let's put in our camera animation now. These are our camera controls here. So to start, I'm going to use the track camera tool to shift the camera over to where the character starts. Then later, when she's at the library entrance, I'll track the camera over, which makes a keyframe for the camera. I want that keyframe on this frame, actually. And we can see how well that keeps the camera on her. I think I actually want the camera move to start a little later so she has a chance to walk in frame before we start following her. So I'm going to move that starting keyframe a little later. And I think I'm going to change the default interpolation to ease in out. So any camera keyframes I create now will have that easing. Then I'll keep adding tracking keyframes as she enters the library and comes to a stop. Then the plan is to do a zoom in to a close-up as she approaches the globe. So I need to position the globe layer to make that work. Then I can use the zoom camera tool to get tighter on her and the globe. I also think I might want to try using the pan tilt tool here to give us more of an upshot. That gives us a better look at the library, and we may as well take advantage of the fact that we have a 3D set and can move the camera like this. Okay, so that walk-up looks good, and she's at the right place in the frame for all these parts of the stopping animation. Now I'm realizing there's an issue with the library model. It has this post in the foreground here at the entrance, and there's no way to make Betsy go behind it without going behind the whole library. I could edit the model to cut that out, but I think we can solve that with some creative camera work in a minute. For now, I think I want to go back to the beginning and zoom in there as well, and also make it a bit of an upshot. I think I want to start out focused on the window and then let Betsy walk into frame. We want to make sure the camera gets wide by this point so we can see all the nice full body poses. And then when she stops at the entrance, I want to zoom in closer. I'm going to go in far enough that we don't cross the foreground post. Then I'm going to go into the motion graph for the camera and smooth out the curve so the speed changes are more subtle. And then just a little adjustment to the zoom curve. And now we're ready to do our camera trick. We're actually going to turn this into two separate shots. On the very next frame after the point we stopped here, I'm going to swing the camera all the way to the other side of the doorpost, and then zoom in on the face to make the shot different enough that it doesn't feel like a jump cut. There, now it just looks like it's cutting between two separate shots. Then we'll slowly pull out as she enters and looks around, and then hook back up with the animation we did for the zoom in on the walk up. So now that we have our camera positioned, I'm going to adjust the background so we can actually see some of that cityscape. And now let's hit Command R to do a render. And this is what the scene is going to look like. I think we can enhance this by enabling depth of field to push the background out of focus. That will keep the viewer's focus on the character. Let's go to the project settings and turn on depth of field. If we check how that looks, it looks like the character is actually out of focus. If we look at the 3D view, we can see now that we have this box to indicate the depth of field effect. The line in the center is the distance from the camera that is in focus, and the square is the range that stays in focus. Beyond that, things will start to get blurred based on their distance from the camera. So let's go back to the project settings and adjust the focus distance until it's on the character. I think I also want the blur radius lower so the blur isn't as extreme. I think 6 will actually be best. Now when I render, it looks like this. I think that will look good. So now we can see how the shot looks with the camera move. Great, I think that's going to work. Now the next step is to replace the rough animation with our actual character rig. We'll start doing our final character animation in the next video. I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to bring in our character rig and start the process of doing our final character animation. So let's bring in the rig from the library and scale it down. We need to think about how tall she should be when she's standing up. Now, an issue I can see right away is because we have the lower camera angle, we can see by the bounding box of our character that it's slightly tilted in perspective. And that actually ends up making the character look more flat. Fortunately, there's an easy way to fix that. In the layer settings for the character, there's a setting called Face Camera. If I set this to Face Image Plane Free Rotate, the layer will always rotate however it needs to appear parallel to the screen. Now I want to see the timing of my rough animation, so I'll turn on the channel visibility for my frame by frame layer. Now I want to retime this a little so there's time for a pose before this where Betsy is off screen and takes a step into this first position. A handy trick for doing that is to right click on a keyframe and then you have the option to select keys to right. Then I can just drag everything over. And I'll do the same for the keys on the camera channels. Then I'm actually going to mute the channels for the camera move because I want to be able to focus on the full character as I'm animating her. Now let's get the character in position and hook up the target bones for the ankles. Now the first phase of the animation process is called blocking out. This is where I just pose out the rig to create all the key poses for the shot. In this case, by matching up to my rough drawings. Notice I have the default interpolation set to step for this phase, meaning it's not going to add in-betweens yet. These poses are just going to hold in place just like the rough drawings. I'm also doing freeze keys on all these key poses. Also, I'm not worrying about the hands or face at this point. I'm going to need to go back and make some new hand positions to match the gestures in the drawings. We'll do all that in separate passes. I'm noticing that the foot is flattening out too much on some of these poses. I'm going to have to modify the rig to get the range of motion in the ankle that we need. Now for this pose, we want the head to face the other way. To do that, we need to flip the bone. Up here are buttons to flip the bone, and we want this one that flips it sideways. Normally that would be enough. However, in our case, we have an issue. If I lift up the head, you can see the neck is getting twisted. This is because we used point binding to attach the top of the neck to the head bone. This is a big downside of using point rigging, but to fix this, we can just go to the neck layer and select the top 3 points and then flip those horizontally with the controls in the top bar. Now it looks right and we can finish the rest of the pose. At this pose, we're at the first place where we want to use the other version of our braid. So I'll switch the switch to braid sketch. And I think I want to turn on squash and stretch for the braid bones. Then I can draw with the sketch bone tool so the braid is going the opposite direction. Then on the next pose, I need to flip the head back and flip the neck points back. We still want the sketch bone braid, so I won't change that back, but I'll make sure it's on the other side of the head. Then I can just continue blocking things out. Here on this standing pose, I need the foot pointed the other way, so I'll flip the leg bone like we did with the head, and the foot flips with it. Thankfully, this doesn't wreck any of our actual art layers. From here, I can continue working. Notice I've been using onion skinning to make sure the feet line up as she goes through all these poses. As she puts her hands on her hips, I'm realizing her left elbow doesn't look great bent this direction, but we'll fix that later. Now we're to the point where she turns and walks forward. It's a little harder to make the walking convincing the more forward-facing she is. We need to rely more on shortening the leg bones because of the perspective, which doesn't read as clearly. Fortunately, since we're zooming in anyway, the feet and legs will go out of frame pretty fast. I'm also moving the character forward in 3D space instead of just scaling her up. Because of the camera move, it's going to look better if there's an actual perspective change on the character relative to the background. Okay, I've got all the poses blocked in now, but I want to modify some of our SmartBone actions to accommodate these poses. First, for the boots, I'm going to go into all the SmartBone actions to increase the range of motion for the first foot bone, and make sure the foot maintains its volume even at this new angle. Then on that left elbow, we need to be able to bend it left as well as right, but we never set that up. So I'll make an action that shapes the elbow folds properly when it bends in this direction. Okay, so those poses will look better now. Now there's one last pose we need. At the very start, we want a pose of her that starts off screen. That's why we gave ourselves those extra frames. Okay, now that we've got all our key poses blocked out, we need to make it transition properly from one pose to the next. I start by setting a set of keyframes to linear interpolation. You could also use smooth or one of the ease in, ease out interpolations, if that makes sense for the particular spot you're at. Then I check how that default motion looks and add additional in-between keyframes that make the motion more correct. I'm especially focusing on the feet and using onion skinning to make sure they're staying in place as the layer for the character moves. For the head turn, I need to find the exact right frame in the middle of the turn where the head bone needs to flip, and the right place to transition from the dynamic braid to the sketch bone braid. For the point where she stops at the entryway, I'm going to enable squash and stretch scaling and IK stretching on the leg bones so she can stretch a little further when she pops up and then settles into the resting pose. Here where she stops in her tracks, the IK for the legs is getting a little haywire because I had the knee break and bend the other direction for that one pose. So I need to track down frame by frame exactly the frame where it should change from one direction to the other. And also it looks like we're pushing the limits of the skirt here on a few frames because the thigh needs to come up pretty high. We may need to extend the range of the skirt actions too. But for now, let's just finish our rough in-between. Okay, that's all the in-between frames we want to put in. Now let's switch to the motion graph and work on smoothing out our curves. I'm starting with the main root bone, specifically the Y dimension, because that's going to define the overall motion of the body. I'm just converting my keyframes to Bezier and using the handles to smooth out the curve so she's transitioning smoothly when she changes the direction she's moving. On the curve for the foot target bones, things are a little more jagged, so I'm going to shift points around in addition to using the Bezier handles to create smoother arcs. It's really important for the whole path and speed of the step to be in nice fluid arcs, otherwise the walk won't look natural. In fact, whenever possible, I'm going to delete keyframes entirely and just rely on the curve handles to get things in the right position. When I get to this stopping animation, I'm finding that it could use some more time to play out and let the leg hang longer. So I'm going to select my keys and move them to the right to put some more frames in between each of the keyframes. Got to make sure to move all the camera frames over to match. When I get into smoothing the bones for the spine up through the head, I'm being very aggressive about deleting extraneous points and making bigger, smoother curves. That makes it easier to control the overall arc and bend of the body over the course of longer sections of the animation. And it makes it easier to use the curve handles to overshoot and offset the peaks and valleys of the curve so the bones in the chain can offset a little like we did with the arms on our walk cycle. And of course, the same idea applies to the arms here as well. It always adds some nice overlapping action when you can get different parts of the body moving on different timing. On this stop animation especially, there should be a lot of overlapping action as the leg, spine, head, arms all slow and change direction at different rates. Now for this spot here where she puts her hands on her hips, I'm actually going to switch to using the target bones for the arms. Thankfully, bone targeting is something you can switch on and off in the middle of an animation. Then once the hands are in contact with the hips, I'm going to parent the target bones to the hips so I know they won't shift around. Then when she goes to touch her chin, I'll break the target bone link on that hand, and then the other one a few frames later. Now the motion of the body is good, so we're ready to start doing our finishing touches, like going through and matching up the skirt. I know there's some spots where the skirt doesn't quite stretch far enough. I could try changing the angle of the hip bone, but I don't want to compromise the animation we just did. So I'm going to extend the range of motion on the skirt bone actions. This time I'm actually going to extend the angle constraints of the bone dials. And inside the actions for the skirt, I'm actually going to make an additional keyframe at 60 past the one here that we already set for the farthest stretch position at 48. This way, anywhere in the animation where I've already set the skirt position, it should remain pretty close. Then I can just finish positioning the skirt on all of the poses. I'll try to keep the number of keys I use to a minimum and rely on the motion curve to make sure the skirt is changing shape right. Now I'm going to do a pass where I focus on the ponytail. For the section here where it's in sketchboard mode, I want to make sure it's following nicely along the path the head is traveling. And I want it to swing, overshoot, and settle when she comes to a rest by the entrance. In the sections where it's in dynamic mode, I'm going to go in one more time and play around with the bone dynamics so it bounces right in these particular shots. Now I need those new hand poses, so I'm going to duplicate some of the positions already in the switches and then modify the fingers. Then I just make sure it switches to those hand poses at the right point in the animation. And now, just to make that transition to shot 2 smoother at the entryway, I'm going to shift all the keyframes over to create a slight pause before she starts moving after the camera angle cuts. I'm going to copy and paste that first set of keyframes and set them to step to make sure there's no accidental animation during the pause. Cool, now let's play the scene and see how it looks. Awesome. Now the next big thing holding back the scene from being great is that we haven't done much with the facial animation. And also she is going to have a line of dialogue when she notices the globe. So I'll do the facial animation and lip sync in the next video. I'll see you there. So we've got the body animation done, and in this video we're going to focus on the face. This phase of the animation will go a lot quicker because the face doesn't need to move nearly as much as the body does. We're going to be dealing with these controls over here. Now remember that we assigned these control bones a color when we set them up. So each set of those controls gets a colored channel down here on the timeline to show their keyframes. That's going to be quite handy. Now all these channels have keyframes from where I did freeze keys on the body. And I did already set eye positions as I did the body, so those should remain. But all these other channels should have their keyframes cleared before I get started. So I'll delete all the keys except the rotation property on the orange eye position bones. Now I can start working on the face. On the first frame, I'll establish a baseline expression that looks a little more sneaky and devious to go along with her sneaking animation. One thing I'm looking out for is anywhere where the head is tilting, I want to move the pupils and the eyelids so that it looks like she's keeping her eye line steady. Anytime I want to set keys to freeze the current position of a bone, I just click on the bone, and then I can come out later and set a new position. Then a big part of making this convincing is putting blinks in the right spot. In general, whenever the head moves suddenly or turns, a person will instinctively blink, like on the swings forward with these big steps here. And then for the next step, I'll just copy and paste the keys from the last blink. Then I'll put a quick blink in the middle of the head turn. And when she's looking back, I'll raise the back eyebrow in that direction. Though, of course, because the head flips here, I need to reverse which eyebrow gets raised at the point the head switches. Then another blink on the turn back. Then when she pops up to lean against the wall, I'll close her eyes as she goes into the dip. I'll just copy and paste the keys from one of the old blinks. And then make them go extra wide when she's at the top of the bounce. And then relax back when she settles. And I'll tilt the eyebrows again on this pose. Now it looks like there's something weird going on with the eye here. Since I haven't seen it before, it must be on the top lid opening action. Here I can see somehow the line width setting on this one point got set super huge. So I'm just going to delete the line width keyframe from the timeline here. That must have got set by accident. Now it looks normal and our expression should look right. During the pause here, I'm going to make the eyes squint and focus a little. Since this is a close-up on the face, we don't want it to be completely still. Then once she steps in, she's going to look around the room. So I'm getting the eyes and eyebrows to match the tilt of the head and the direction of the pupils. Then when she notices the globe, I'll switch the mouth to help give her a surprised expression. Then she's going to transition from the surprised expression to a sort of suspicious expression. Then I'll switch the mouth to the thinking pose I made. Now we're to the part where she has a line of dialogue, so I'll need to import the audio for that. I'll go to File, Import, Audio File, and find the file. And you can see the waveform is represented behind the keyframes here. But to position that sound, we'll switch to the sequencer view. I can see the line is going to go past the current end of the shot, so I'll extend the length of the shot a little. Now I just need to match up the start of the line with where I want it to start in the animation.
Well, what do we have here?
Actually, I think that should start a little sooner, so I'll just shift the layer back.
Well.
Okay, that's a good place to start. Now I just need to go through the line listening and switching the mouth to the right position. I'm going to open the switch selection window to help with that. In general, it's a good idea to have the mouth position precede the sound that it makes by a couple frames. Now, when I'm checking something really precise, like lip sync, I'm going to turn off all the background elements to save on my CPU. I want to make sure we don't get any dropped frames when it tries to play back the timeline. We need to see every mouth position.
Well, what do we have here?
I think the mouth positions on well are coming just a hair too soon, so I'm going to select all of those and then shift them just a couple frames.
Well, what do we have here?
Okay, that's matching up pretty well. Now we can go into our switch's layer settings, and on the Switch tab, enable Interpolate Sublayers. Remember, we specifically set up the mouth so that it's able to do this. And now it's transitioning from each pose to the next instead of switching. That's going to make it look a lot smoother. Then, since we extended the end of the scene, I'm going to do some additional animation just so she continues to shift and settle a little. We don't want her to be suddenly totally still except for the mouth. Also, I can go through and put in appropriate facial expressions to go along with the line now. There's one last thing I missed. It's interpolating all the mouth positions, including the ones we set for the expression earlier. So to make sure she holds on the thinking position for the sound, I'm going to copy that keyframe and paste it just before the rest of the actual words start. Okay, the dialogue should be good. Now let's check the whole scene.
Well, what do we have here?
Cool. So that's the actual animation finished. Next, we're going to enhance our scene by adding some cool lighting and particle effects. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to enhance the animation we've done by adding some lighting effects to our character as she moves through the scene. And we're also going to make a particle effect that will make it rain outside our windows. Let's start with the lighting. If we go to the layer settings for the character, you can see there's a layer shading option. By enabling this and setting the settings right, Moho will try to automatically add shadows to your character. You can't see it on the stage, but if we come out a little ways and Command R to render a preview, you can see Betsy gets these shadows added along her edge that give her a little more volume. However, that's not what we're going to be using this effect for. We actually want to do the opposite. So in the layer settings, I'm going to reverse the direction of the shadow And I'm going to make the shadow inverted. And I'll also just lower the blur a little. Now when I do a render, we get light up top instead of dark underneath. In fact, I'm going to change the shading color to be a little darker and make the offset bigger so there's more light up top. Cool. That looks good, but we're going to try to do something more advanced and have the lighting change as she goes past each window. I'll warn you that the way I came up to do this is a bit of a hack, but the results will be really cool. First, what I'm going to do is right-click the character layer and pick Reference Layer. Now, this is a perfect replica of the character and all her animation, except I'm going to change the layer shading to come from the front and set the offset to 1 so it will hardly be noticeable. And she'll almost be entirely in shadow. This is for when she's between windows and not getting any light from outside. Now you might notice on the stage, my reference version of Betsy looks super messed up and distorted. That's just some fluke of the stage preview. If I do a render, you can see she looks totally fine. She's going to end up looking really bizarre on the stage, but the rendered version is what we care about. Now I'm going to make another reference of Betsy, giving us 3 copies in total. And I'll change the shadow settings on this one so the light will be coming from top right and have a really big offset. This is for when she's standing at the entryway and the light is coming from the library. Now we're going to use masks to control what version of Betsy is visible in what part of the scene. So on a new vector layer, I'm going to draw 3 big rectangles. Now I'm going to turn my camera animation channels back on so that I can make sure these rectangles line up correctly with the windows from the perspective of the camera as we move through the shot. Then I'll make the rectangles filled and take off the strokes. And there's our first mask. And I'll put that layer in a group with Betsy too. Now to set the mask settings. We want the mask setting on the group to reveal all, and we want the window mask layer at the bottom and set to subtract from mask. And of course, we want Betsy herself set to mask this layer. Then if I render, you can see part of her is getting the light from the window and the rest of her is all dark. As a finishing touch, we'll go to the layer settings for the mask layer and give it some blur. Now there's not a harsh edge where she crosses the matte line. Next we need a mask to reveal the Betsy lit from the library. So I'll make a new layer and set up that mask. I want it sloped, and there's going to be a fairly big blur on it, so I need it to cover her quite a bit to create the right transition as she approaches. And I'll put it in a group with Betsy 3 called Library Light Region. And the mask should go at the bottom. Now this time we want the mask set to hide all, and the mask layer set to add to mask but keep invisible, and Betsy set to mask this layer. And then when we render, we can see on this particular frame, her back half is lit by the window and her front is getting lit from the library. Now on the other side of the cut, we need one more Betsy reference. Then in sequence review, I'm going to set the visibility of the first 3 Betsys to end at the cut, and this 4th copy to only become visible after the cut, just for simplicity. And on this Betsy, I'm just going to turn the shadow effect off. But we still need her back half in shadow to match up with the end of the last shot. So this time I'll make a new layer and draw a shape on it that will serve as our shadow. Then I'll position it and make it vaguely follow the contours of her head and body. And I'm going to look at the shadow settings for one of our other Betsys so I can find the shadow color and copy it. Then I can make the shot to entry shadow match. And I'll add a blur to that layer as well. Now this time we're actually going to use Betsy as the mask. So I'll put her and the entryway shadow in a group together. and set the group masking to hide all, and set the entryway shadow to mask this layer, and Betsy to add to mask. And if we do a render, there we go, that looks good. Then I'll set the entryway shadow layer to only become visible after the cut. For the rest of this shot, she'll step out of the shadow and just be in the light. And that's it for the shadows. Next, we're going to make it rain outside with some particle effects. First, we need a particle, so I'm just going to make a new layer and draw a long raindrop. Then we'll make a new particle group called rainfall. And then in the layer settings, open up the particle tab. Oops, I need to put our raindrop inside the particle group. And now out on the timeline, it's using the raindrop as a particle, but it's not behaving like rain. So let's adjust the settings. First of all, let's set the direction to down. And we don't want any acceleration. They should already be going at full speed. Then if I find where they actually are, I can see they're offset from the center of the particle layer a lot. So in the raindrop layer, I'll make sure to set the anchor point centered on the raindrop. And now they're coming from the center of the particle system. Now let's make the source width super wide. This is the region that's going to be generating raindrops. We want it to cover the whole range outside the window. We can also make it a little taller too. Now it looks like I've got the raindrop upside down for the direction we want it to move, so I'll just go into that layer and flip it around. Okay, now the rain is pointed down. Then let's get our particle system outside the windows. I'll orbit the camera and then shift the particle group back so it's behind the windows. I'm also going to increase the source depth of the particle group so that our particles will spawn in the 3D space with some closer or farther away from the camera. Of course, I need to put the actual rainfall layer behind the library model layer. And of course, we want to put the source of the rain up higher than the windows. And now I think I need to scale the raindrop down a bunch. Looks like I definitely want to increase the velocity, and I'm also going to increase the source depth even more. And I want to set the spread for the direction to 0 so the drops are all falling in the same direction. And let's do a render to check. It looks like the raindrops are still too big, so I'll scale the drop down again. Then I'm going to up the velocity and lower the lifespan. The lifespan is how many frames a given particle exists for. Each drop only needs to exist long enough to move past the window where we can see it. So the faster it's going, the less its lifespan needs to be. This will let us get by having to generate fewer total particles in the system. Okay, now that's looking more like how we want. But the rain should be a little denser, so let's up the particle count. And let's check that. Yeah, that looks like enough to me. And looking at it in motion, I think we could stand to up the velocity some more. And there we go. That rain looks good to me. Now, since I decided to use this 3D model as my background, I need to go in and deal with the color and lighting on all of the surfaces. On the Materials tab for that layer, I need to go through each of the materials for the different surfaces in the model and adjust the lighting. I want to reduce the banding effect of the toon shading. In general, a good way to do that is to decrease the intensity of the diffuse and specular lights and increase the ambient intensity. Okay, then the last thing is to replace the sketch of our globe. So I'm going to bring in another 3D model. Now I need to use the lighting tool to set the direction for the light. And it's banding really bad, so if I go into the material for the globe itself, I'm going to make sure to up the bands to 8. Then I'm going to up the ambience and lower the diffuse and specular. But we don't want to lose the shadows entirely, so I need to play around and find the right diffuse and specular settings. Okay, I think that's going to work fine for this shot. Okay, now that we've done all these effects, we want to see what they look like in motion. Since we can't see them on our timeline's playback, we're going to need to export our animation. We'll look at how to export an animation in the next video. I'll see you there. So we've got the animation all finished, but with all these effects we're using, we can't really tell how it looks until we do a full export of the animation. We've been able to render a single frame, but now we want to see the full thing with all the effects in motion. To do that, we go to the File menu. And first of all, I wanted to point out this option, Preview Animation. This will render things out basically the same way you see them on the stage, but it will process every frame ahead of time and then show them as a movie. So if your machine is sluggish and you're having problems with the frame rate of your playback on the stage, this is a fast way to see what your animation looks like at full speed. However, it still won't process all the styles and effects, which is what we want to see. For that, we want to choose Export Animation. Then we have options for how to configure the export. We can specify the frame range we want to export. Then we can choose the output format. There are a couple of video formats, or you can export a Flash SWF, or a GIF, or an SVG, or you can do an image sequence. Now, if you need a very high quality export of a shot to composite or edit in another program, you might want to export an image sequence or use one of the QuickTime formats if you need sound. But if you're exporting your final video out of Moho, we'll be fine just using the MP4 setting. Then down here you have render options. Most of these have to do with ways to make your render go faster, which you might want to do if you're in the middle of the animation process and just want to check on how the scene is shaping up. You definitely want multi-threading enabled to make things faster if your CPU supports it. You can render at half dimensions or half the frame rate. Those will both make the render twice as fast. You can disable effects on shapes, like the grass image texture on our ground, or layer effects like the shadows on the character. And you can reduce particles so there's less calculations to be done with that. And you can turn off anti-aliasing or extra smoothing on images. All of those will reduce some aspect of your quality, but make the rendering process a lot faster. The other thing you might want to do is just render a particular part of your scene. You could enable rendering muted channels or not. So if this was off, any animation channel you disable on the timeline will stay disabled in your export. For example, if we were to mute the zoom channel on our camera, it would give us a wide shot version of the whole animation. And on this drop down here, if you have any layer comps set up in your scene, you can specify one and it will only render layers that are part of that layer comp. Like here, I have layer comps for each level of the set. This can be handy if you just want to get your elements out of Moho and composite them in After Effects or another editing program. Then you can specify where you want to save your file and the file name. And finally, down here with this dropdown, you can save your configuration of settings with a name so it will appear on this menu and you can reuse it. Now there is a slightly more advanced option for exporting, and that is under File, Moho Exporter. Now what this is basically a queue for different rendering jobs. You'll notice it automatically added a render job for both of the Moho projects I currently have open. You can also click Add and find another Moho project to add an export job for that file. This way, if you have a lot of content to export, you can set up all your scenes to render, press play to start the queue, and leave and come back later. If you double click on a job, you can get the same settings we were just looking at. Now, even if you don't have multiple project files, there are other reasons you might want to set up multiple export jobs. For example, I could just duplicate this for our main scene and configure the two exports differently. Like, for example, since we actually have two shots in this project, I could change the frame range on one job to just the first shot and the other job to the rest of the timeline. Then that would give me two separate files for the two shots if I wanted to edit them in a separate editor as part of a larger video. Or if I wanted my layer comps separate, I could make a job to render each one. In fact, this button here will automatically separate the current job into separate ones for each layer comp. There's even a column to show which layer comp each job is rendering. But in this case, I'm just going to export the whole scene as a single MP4 video with all the effects on. I'm going to make sure the layer comp is set to the one I made for all. Then we just press play and let that run, which, because of the complexity of our scene and all the effects, it's going to take a long time. You can see the status for each job in the column over here. Okay, that took a long time to render, but we're finally ready to check out our final scene.
Well, what do we have here?
Awesome, so that's it. That concludes our animation process and the course. I hope you're feeling inspired to dig into Moho and do some animation of your own. You can try using the Betsy rig that comes with the course, or use the features we've covered to rig a character of your own. Now that you're familiar with the software, you might want to check out one of Bloop Animation's skills courses. Animation Foundations is your best option for learning or improving your animation skills. You'll learn all the principles and skills that go into great character animation. If you want to go back a step and learn how to visualize a story for animation, check out Storyboarding Foundations. You'll learn all the filmmaking terminology and storyboarding techniques for planning out shots that you can then animate in software like Moho. If you want to go even higher level, you can learn the entire animation pipeline in making an animated movie. All 30 of these lessons come free with every course, so you should already have access. Check it out if you haven't already. I think you're going to love working in Moho, and we can't wait to see what you create. Share your creations on social media with the hashtag MadeWithMoho. Have fun and get animating.